today I wanted to talk to you about the 5 modifications I almost always make to sweater patterns. So if you are used to just getting your pattern and following it as written, that is perfectly fine. But this is just to give you an idea of some small changes you can make to perhaps get a better fit or get a style that is more to your liking. So the first thing that I almost always do to a sweater pattern is to shorten the body. I am very short-waisted. Most of my height is in my legs and very little of it is in my torso. So if I knit sweaters as long as said in the pattern, they usually end up coming out much too long for me and falling at kind of an unflattering spot. The other consideration there, even if you're not short-waisted, is that most sweaters will grow a little bit when you block them. Now, this is where swatching is important because you want to get an idea of how much your yarn is likely to grow when you block things. But as this is something that is really hard to kind of build into the pattern, most patterns will say things like knit the body until it's 15 inches from the armhole. And even if I'm not shortening the body dramatically, I'm still going to knit at least a ½ inch shorter than that to make up for that growth that I'm almost positive is going to happen. There are other lengths that you might want to consider adjusting as well. The sleeves, obviously. You might want to double check the armholes, make sure they are not longer than you would like. Again, noting that there's going to be some growth there, probably. But if, for example, you happen to know that this part of your body is longer or shorter than the average for your size, you might want to make an adjustment there as well. So basically just keep an eye on the lengths in your pattern and remember that generally speaking, especially for the body and sleeves, those are a suggestion and are very easily customizable. So don't knit sweaters that end up being too long for you. Just make that adjustment yourself. For that, of course, you have to know how long you like various parts of your sweater, so make sure you are taking your measurements as well. The second change that I often make has to do with the sleeves. I have pretty skinny arms, so a lot of times the sleeves of a sweater end up being just a little bit bigger than I like. However, if your pattern is a cardigan with sleeves knit in the round, which is a lot of the sweaters that I knit for myself, or it's a sweater that's knit flat with sleeves knit in the round, I often don't really have to do any math there. I just don't change my needle size when I go to work on the sleeves. So this is again where it's important to know your own knitting, your own habits. For me, almost always I knit tighter knitting in the round than I do knitting flat. So if I stick to the same needle size, my sleeves are automatically going to come out smaller if the body of the sweater was worked flat and the sleeves are knit in the round. On the other hand, if I do want the sleeves to be the same size as recommended in the pattern, the same circumference, I might go up a needle size. Ideally, you really do want to swatch both flat and in the round if your pattern has parts that are flat and in the round, so you can double check that gauge. But over time, that's just a distinction that you're going to get to know, whether you knit tighter knitting in the round or not, and you can make that adjustment on your own. So, on the other hand, if the sleeves are also knit flat, I might actually go down a needle size so that they end up being just a little bit smaller. And you can make the same adjustment easily for yourself by changing your needle size without having to redo all of the sleeve math if you just prefer your sleeves a little bit looser or a little bit tighter than what is recommended in the pattern. That's an easy one, changing your needle size. The third thing that I almost always change when working a sweater pattern is the ribbing. I, generally speaking, don't really like a 2x2 rib. I much prefer a 1x1 rib, especially in heavier yarns. That 2x2 rib just can be a little bit bulky, and I just think a 1x1 rib looks nicer. So I almost always swap those two things out. If the pattern calls for a 2x2 rib, I just check the numbers and make sure I can get my 1x1 rib in there. Now obviously 2x2 rib is divisible by 4, so it should also be divisible by 2, but sometimes there are selvage stitches that you want to make sure end up in the right order in the pattern, whether that's a knit or a purl. So again, that's a really easy thing to change. It does depend on the weight of the yarn, because for something like a cuff, or maybe you want a little bit more structure, you may want to leave that as a 2x2 if it's a really light yarn. But for me, I really prefer a 1x1 rib, and so I will almost always change that in my sweaters. And sort of to go along with that, the other thing, number 4, that I usually change in my sweater patterns when I'm working for myself is I change my cast-ons and bind-offs. A 1x1 rib works much nicer with the tubular cast-on and tubular bind-off, or if you're finding those a little fiddly, the alternating cable cast-on. They all look really neat and tidy. There are ways to do a tubular bind-off over a 2x2 rib, but it just gets a little fiddly because you have to kind of switch stitches around to reorder them in a knit one purl one pattern, and it just, in my opinion, doesn't look as nice in the end. So a plain long tail cast on is fine for socks, but for sweaters, I really think that an alternating cable cast on, tubular cast on, or tubular bind off looks much neater. Especially around the cuffs, but the hem and the collar as well. So when I switch up my ribbing, I also go ahead and switch up my cast-ons and bind-offs just to make it look a little bit neater and a little bit tidier. If you're not familiar with those cast-ons, I do have tutorials for them. They give the edge of your fabric a kind of slightly turned under neat look. Let me give you an example. All right, so this is my Lunita hat pattern, and I did a 1x1 rib at the rim, and I did a tubular cast on. So you can see it almost just looks like that bottom stitch, please don't look at my face, is curling, folding under a little bit. It just gives it a really neat edge. It's still flexible, but it doesn't draw in as much. So if you're working on something like a sock that needs that ribbing to draw in, that's where you aren't really going to be using that kind of tubular cast on. But for hems and cuffs, usually you don't really need it to pull in a lot because you're not trying to hold anything up like a sock cuff. So it actually works quite neatly. So give that a look if you are interested in just really neat and tidy hems for your sweaters, tubular cast on, tubular bind off, or alternating cable cast on. And the last thing that I almost always change is a more recent one, but that is that I almost always swap out wrap and torn short rows for German short rows. So I only learned German short rows within the last couple of years, but I love them. I think they look so much nicer than wrap and torn short rows. Maybe I'm just not very good at wrap and torn short rows. But I always find that no matter how carefully I try to pick up my wraps and work them together with my stitches, they just don't look very neat. And they stick out to me. I don't know if they stick out, when other people see my knits, but the German short rows, I don't have that problem. They just look, if I'm really looking for them, I can find them. but they just seem to blend into the fabric much more easily, and it's actually a really simple swap to make. So when you're working wrap and turn short rows, it usually says something like work to 3 stitches before the last wrapped stitch, wrap and turn. So if you're working to 3 stitches before, that next stitch is the one you're wrapping and turning. So if you were doing the German short rows, you would work to 4 stitches before your last wrap stitch, because you're going to work the short row on that stitch after you turn. And that's it. That's really the only change. They're very easy to swap in and out, and I just think they look so much nicer. So there you have it, from a semi-retired knitting pattern designer, the 5 things I almost always change in sweater patterns when I am working on personal sweaters for myself. And I hope that just gives you an idea about how you can change things up, customize things, make them easier for you or more flattering for you, or just work to your own strengths and make the kind of sweater projects that you are proud to wear when you're done.